Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. Today's episode is all about the intersection of economics, public policy, and politics. My guest is The Atlantic's Rogé Karma. Rogé covers the broad economic policy beat, and he was previously a senior editor at the Ezra Klein Show. In today's conversation, we cover everything from why and how the Bidenomics economic agenda didn't meet the political moment, yet at the same time, Kamala Harris embraced the underlying principles behind the economic philosophy during her DNC acceptance speech last week. We also cover why, if anything, there is a case to be made that public policy and political programs still matter when voters care most of all about the issue of inflation, prices, and the broader set of issues everyone's experienced post-COVID. We, of course, also discuss the nature of how the left and right have struggled to put together programs that can meet the post-2016 political moment. Huge thank you to the Foundation for American Innovation for supporting the work of this podcast, and I hope you all enjoy the conversation. Rogé Karma, welcome to the Realignment.
Thanks so much for having me, Marshall.
So you and I have had plenty of conversations off of a podcast. I've read all of your recent pieces, but because we're going to very explicitly talk about a bunch of your work, I would love for you just to define for everyone what your beat is at The Atlantic.
So my beat officially is economics and economic policy. But the way that I think about it is more of economic paradigms that sort of, as we exit an era defined by what some will call neoliberalism, some would call Reaganomics, laissez-faire, free market capitalism, and towards, as that sort of old framework of understanding the economy and the relationship between the economy and the rest of the world, as that crumbles and something new emerges, we need more journalists to be covering that thing, that emergence. And I think the way I think about my role and my beat is to be covering that shift as opposed to covering the ups and downs of the stock market or just the Federal Reserve's decisions to raise interest rates, which I also cover, to be fair. But I think that is like how I would describe my broader beat.
Great answer. And that takes us into one of your pieces that I think genuinely has done a better job than 98% of the very well-financed efforts to say that like the era of neoliberalism is over and Reaganomics is over and there's a new economic paradigm and this or that. You make it very tangible at a policy level for folks. Let's talk about your Reaganomics is on its last legs piece. You specifically say, look, post-1980, you say all the things we have to say at the start of these pieces. Post-1980, there was this idea that markets are inherently positive and that they can solve all of these problems that the old New Deal, big government, let's pass a big bill and Congress approach couldn't actually address. After 2015, 2016, after COVID, there's clearly been a new, let's say, consensus or a new approach that's been taken at a bipartisan level. But let's just get that out of like the sort of airy-fairy intangible space and make it very practical. How do you use trade as a center point for saying, no, this is real, this has happened, and everyone needs to think about how that change has happened and why it matters?
I think this is trade as an issue is probably the most salient part of, if you believe that a new economic consensus is emerging, I really do think it is there. I think the sort of, as you were saying, I think there was a view pre-Trump that, as we were talking about, I know this is the exact wind-up you were trying to avoid, but there was a sort of a broad view that open trade between countries all over the world would result in a sort of rising economic tide that would lift all boats domestically and a political liberalization that would turn closed authoritarian countries more democratic, with the example there being China. And I think what you had is, right, you had the North American Free Trade Agreement, you later in the Obama administration had the Trans-Pacific Partnership, you had Chinese ascension to the WTO. The dominating policy paradigm was open up trade, increase the flow of goods, and both economic prosperity and political liberalization will follow. And I think that completely changed in the aftermath of 2016. After 2016, you have Donald Trump coming out and railing against those trade agreements. And then specifically, you have him come out with a set of tariffs on China. You have him come out with trade restrictions on China. And that was a break, but that does not make a new consensus. What makes then a new consensus is when Joe Biden comes into office. And by the way, Joe Biden had criticized Trump's tariff war. So there was not... A lot of times what happens in American politics is like there's a thermostatic response of polarization where one party will lean into the anti-trade stuff. It will cause the other party to double down on their bona fides. And like you will end up with a sort of back and forth dynamic. That did not happen here. Joe Biden comes in, he keeps almost all of Trump's trade restrictions on China, and then he goes further. The first thing he does, which is really important, is he does export controls on semiconductors. We can talk more about that, but that is an active effort to say this is a good that we are not going to let get into China's hands because we think it is valuable. The second thing, which this piece came out of, was the recent slate of tariffs that the Biden administration levied, mostly on clean energy technologies. A wide variety of them, but this was largely centered on Chinese EVs. And the thinking of the Biden administration in doing this was that if we end up with a flood of Chinese vehicles, because the Chinese, and specifically the Chinese company BYD, have now become the biggest exporter of autos in the world, and specifically of EVs in the world, if we allow a flood of Chinese cars to enter the US economy, we will end up with a second version of what became known as the China shock. We will see the US auto industry crippled. We will see the loss of manufacturing jobs in a lot of key Midwestern states. And so what we have to do is, instead of accepting the free flow of goods, the free flow of cars in this case, we are actually going to draw a pretty firm wall around our auto industry. We're going to combine that with investments in that industry to make sure that it can be strong in and of itself. But I think that for me was this turning point where, oh my gosh, like it is not only now that one party has gone into anti sort of free trade direction, it is another party that has now actually amped up, has actually amplified what was previously a 25% tariff now to 100% on Chinese electric vehicles, which is pretty steep and I think a pretty big departure from where we were for a while.
And as you put it in the piece, Trump then starts off by saying, good job, Joe Biden, you followed my lead. And then B, he says, and actually, we shouldn't have those be 100% tariffs. Those should be 200% tariffs. So if this were a typical, let's say, 2016 area policy area, you would expect the debate to be openness versus closed, but instead we're both arguing within this same framework of no, like let's take it as given that free trade isn't just like not only an unalloyed good, but it's actually a danger point for these specific areas, and we're debating the degree to which we need to respond to it. Another thing,
Marshall, you see the same thing on the Democratic, and you see the same thing on the Democratic side. The response from Democrats is not, as it was during the Trump administration, attacking Joe Biden for throwing up walls and being too much like Trump. It was congratulations. And in some cases, like Senator Sherrod Brown, it was like, well, we really approve of this, but actually we should just ban Chinese EVs altogether. And so it was like you saw both on the Democrat and the Republican side. The debate was not against, like, as you said, open versus closeness. It was more or less of the same thing, which is very far from where we were previously.
And I'm always fascinated by policy areas where, because there's a lot of cynicism in the spaces that you and I cover, but I think this, regardless of your position on what tariffs or whether we shouldn't have tariffs at all on Chinese EVs, this is actually an example of how ideas and policies actually matter. And it's actually true that when the world changes, when 2016 happens, when COVID happens, when the US has a different relationship in China, policymakers will take different positions, even ones that could contradict or go against their own inherent interests, because there's definitely a wing of the left or the Democratic Party that could very tangibly make the following argument, which is, hey, at the end of the day, guys, climate change is this existential threat to the world. Conflict with China is this existential escalatory threat that we're facing. At the end of the day, who cares how many EVs are made in Michigan if at the end of the day we need to dramatically reduce CO2 emissions? And if the Chinese have found a way to not only make these cars attractive, but also quality and then cheaper, then we need to just do whatever we need to do to make that basically happen instead of being short-termly nationalist. That argument didn't win out, though it's very easy to make the sort of like left-leaning like counter case against it. So that's just an example of like, once again, this could have gone a bunch of different directions. This is also true with China policy in general, because what you could have had is a situation where the Biden administration said, look, here's how this went down. Trump was way too supplicatory towards Russia. He was way too aggressive towards China. We're going to pivot towards Russia and pivot away towards conflict with China. They didn't do that. So regardless of one's actual thoughts on how we should respond to those two issues, the fact that there was actually a shift in approach goes to the actual point that just like the operating paradigm of politicians left, right, and center has shifted.
I think you're right. And I think this, especially the climate argument you just made, which I had another piece about, which I sort of called Biden's EV dilemma, which was exactly this point, right? That you have these dual priorities, which is on the one hand, you have this influx. If the Biden administration at the time had two very big goals, right? One of them was to decarbonize the US economy and another was to bring down prices. And there's almost no better policy to do both of those things than import a bunch of very cheap, high quality Chinese electric vehicles. And I think the reason you don't see that happening is because I think a lot of the new sort of emerging economic paradigm is trying to put the politics back into political economy. I think there was a time in which these were viewed as separate things, but I think actually when you ask members of the Biden administration, they did not see this as a trade-off. They did not see it as a trade-off between the climate and between restricting Chinese EVs because they viewed a flood of Chinese EVs as the single force that would most forcefully undermine the political coalition that's needed to decarbonize in the long term. So in order, right, the Biden administration's entire sort of theory of how you solve the climate crisis is you need to do it in ways that allow for normal, ordinary Americans to feel like they are benefiting from it. You cannot just cut oil supply. You cannot issue a carbon tax. If people feel like the energy transition is built on a politics of sacrifice, it will fail and we will never decarbonize.
Yep.
And so when it comes to Chinese EVs, there's one way of looking at it, but like, well, don't you want people to be able to have cheaper EVs? But the other way of looking at it is if you end up having climate change and the fight against climate change associated with the death of the American auto industry, the loss of this industry that I think has a specific place in our national identity and has many workers in swing states that decide the outcome of elections, what you are doing is you are helping empower the very politicians that are going to roll back your decarbonization agenda. And so I think a lot of this new paradigm, it's the power of ideas, but it's also the power of placing politics at the center of economic policymaking, which I think was, at least at times, sort of forgotten about, or at the very least, the theory was a little bit mixed.
Here's what I'm fascinated to hear about. You just referenced the ideas issue I raised. You also wrote another piece that just questioned the idea that policy even matters during this period, which resonated with me because as a person who puts out a very, let's say 80% policy, 20% politics podcast gets at the core of like what I'm trying to do with this project, which is you focused on pharmaceutical drug pricing and how the Biden administration made a variety of moves in the space, yet there's been literally zero political reward or even recognition for that dynamic. I'd love you to just like get into the topic of the piece and like what you were getting at with your point about the question whether policy matters.
I appreciate that. And this is a perpetual bugaboo of mine too. This is a perpetual interest of mine too, Marshall, because I am someone who is just policy obsessed and has constantly run up with this question of, I think what started it for me was realizing that when the Inflation Reduction Act passed in 2022, there was this piece of it that no one was talking about, which is for 30 years now, ever since Bill Clinton, Democrats have been saying we are going to bring down prescription drug prices, and specifically, we are going to allow Medicare to negotiate with pharmaceutical companies on drug prices. Every other developed country does this. Every European country. It is why Germany and the UK and Canada pay a fraction for prescription drugs than we do. They use the buying power of their entire healthcare system in order to negotiate down prices with companies. It has long been a policy that Democrats have promised. It has long been a policy that has been extremely popular. When pollsters poll this, it often is the number one policy in terms of popularity. It polls in the 80s and 90s in terms of support. People just are really upset about the high cost of prescription drugs and want it lowered. And so you'd think, okay, if there is a single policy that a politician could pass that would cause them to gain support, it would be this policy that is A, extremely popular, B, in an issue area that people already tend to associate Democrats with, and C, during an inflation crisis where people are really focused on the cost of living. And so Biden comes in in the Inflation Reduction Act. Part of it is he actually successfully passes a policy that would allow Medicare to negotiate down prices for the top 10 grossing drugs every single year. And it would cap out-of-pocket spending on prescription drugs for seniors at $2,000 per year, which is actually, it may sound modest. Right now, for any of the top 10 cancer drugs in the United States, it costs an average of $10,000 to $20,000 every year out of pocket for folks. So this is like a huge cost saving for Americans. And so again, it was like, okay, if there's one policy, and then the last, and also this is focused on seniors. It's focused on the group that tends to vote disproportionately. Okay, if any policy is going to matter, this policy is going to matter. And then what you see is that voters consistently have no idea it was even passed. Even when they do, they say they tend to trust Trump more when it comes to healthcare than Joe Biden. And then consistently you see the president who passed this, and the president who, by the way, passed a lot of other very popular legislation, from building infrastructure to clean energy investments. Like, a lot of these things are very widely popular. And yet his approval rating was rock bottom. His approval rating was below 40%. It was absolutely abysmal. The ratings of the economy were extremely low. And so I think that specific case study caused me to really wrestle with, okay, what is actually going on here? Because there is a theory of politics which said, look, you pass popular things and voters will reward you. It's the most basic facet of politics. And I can get into sort of why my theories of why I think that is, of what was actually going on, of why that might be changing. But I think that was the core dilemma, is this policy is sort of the ultimate case study of a theory of politics that has often been called popularism. And yet it was done, and the president who did it is one of the most unpopular in modern history.
It seems to me, I'd love to hear what your kind of theories are. My immediate response would just be, popular policies are important. I think popularism is a correct idea. It's a good framework for thinking through how you should approach political change and new ideas. But also, popular policies also require, at a minimum, a president who at a core level is capable of being popular. And I think just what the Biden administration, and Biden specifically, just like underestimated was the real degree to which he was making an ask of the American people to like him in, let's just say, the aesthetically aged state he was. And aesthetically is putting it kind of lightly, but I'm trying to be kind of empirical and polite here, because my kind of pushback when people say Biden was too old is like, yes, the speeches were bad, the walk was bad, but just give me a single instance in the actual like presidency where he had to make this big decision, but he fell asleep at the desk, and then the nukes started flying, and then the Russians overwhelmed the Ukrainians, and then all of a sudden this people can't say that because it didn't happen. But like, once again, politics is also aesthetic, so we have to really recognize. And once again, I totally am sympathetic to the idea that we don't want to have presidents in their late 70s or like early 80s. So I'm not even critiquing Americans when they say that, but I kind of like wonder if, let's say, we'd had a President Buttigieg who is capable of articulating things and being younger, vigorous. Let's even put aside like current political actors. Let's say give Bill Clinton that prescription drug policy, give JFK that prescription drug policy, give Theodore Roosevelt or Ronald Reagan do you think this policy issue still be a problem? Or is this really just Joe Biden's negatives were just so high that they swallow everything else, even if those things are supposedly popular?
Yeah. I think it's a few things, and I think you're right. I think a big one also is just one big structural factor happening here. One big just context to everything we're talking about is the sort of structural macroeconomic environment we're operating in, which the pollster Patrick Ruffini described to me as the post-COVID inflationary malaise. Mm-hmm. And this is that all over the world, not just in the United States, incumbents are getting absolutely creamed. They're losing. You have this happening where Narendra Modi almost loses in India. You have the ANC losing power for its first time, or having its worst election since apartheid in South Africa. You have this happening in the UK, in France. You have the surge of far-right parties. But then in the UK, you have the Tories losing. So it's not like just a far-right story. It's a global anti-incumbent backlash. And I think a lot of that is the sort of aftermath of COVID, the aftermath of this like global inflation crisis that people are just really upset about. And to be fair to Joe Biden, his approval rating was very low, but compared to the leaders of France or the UK at the time, or a lot of other countries, he looked like JFK. Like he was actually doing much even better than a lot of European leaders. So I think part of it was his age. Part of it is actually this global backlash, this global anti-incumbent sentiment that was overwhelming anything else. And I think the last thing, though, and I think this last thing actually gets to the differences between Biden and Kamala Harris, is politics can't just be about policy. It has to be about attention. And you need not just a theory of policy, you need a theory of attention. And the Biden administration's theory was if we just talk enough about these popular policies, then people will pay attention to them and people will love us. If we just pass popular things and talk about them, that'll happen. And it doesn't work. When Biden talks about, in his speeches, lowering prescription drug pricing, which he does all the time, people don't really listen. What Donald Trump did, and I think if you talk to a lot of Donald Trump has a very, I think, concrete theory of attention, which is through conflict. And oftentimes, in order to get attention on a policy, in order to get people to care about a policy, you need to create conflict and pick fights that draw attention to the issue. And almost by definition, that is really hard to do with popular policies, because who do you create a conflict with? What is one of the issues that everyone knows Biden for, or most people do? Student debt cancellation, because that created a lot of conflict. It created moderates versus leftists. It created economists versus students. Like it was like a very conflictual issue that created a lot of attention for kind of a 60-40 issue. The Biden administration has had a really hard time generating attention in the same way that Trump did, which was through conflict. And I think one thing that might be different about Kamala Harris, well, two things is one, I think she's doing a lot to sort of shed the the sort of incumbent label. My read of the Democratic National Convention was the Democratic Party was doing everything in their power to say, this is not the Biden administration. We are not going back. It was a contrast between the backward Trump administration and the forward Kamala Harris administration. In the Democratic Party's communication, the Biden administration was largely erased from that convention. It was, we do not want to associate. We do not want you to think of us as incumbents. And the second thing that Harris has done really well is she has a real theory of attention. She picked Tim Walz, right? Not the vice president that was the moderate, Pennsylvania governor who could help on a swing state, but the guy who called Republicans weirdos and got a lot of attention for it. Kamala herself has really focused on this, like, you see coconut tree memes about her, and and you have Charlie XCX, and she and her campaign has a real theory of here's how we get voters interested in politics that I think the Biden administration never had.
Yeah, and I think the whole interesting thing, you wrote a piece on this about Bidenomics without Biden, is I'd love for you to sum up what the Bidenomics economic program and project was, and how, despite all of this, because folks have a lot of questions about what Kamala Harris actually stands for, why in many ways, despite this effort to sort of reject the aesthetic of the Biden administration, this new democratic economic consensus is still moving forward?
That's a great question. So the way that I frame that piece is that Kamala Harris entered her presidential candidacy with a dilemma, which is, on the one hand, the economy is the single most important issue for swing voters by far. And on the other hand, the administration she helped run is deeply unpopular on the economy. And the real question, and Biden's response to this kind of similar dilemma was, I'm just going to talk about how great the economy is. Mm-hmm. I'm going to tell people how low unemployment is. I'm going to talk about all these historic investments we've made. And it just crashed and burned. It absolutely failed.
To just add real quick, and this is really relevant. The reason why I'm so obsessed with Bidenomics as a frame isn't just the policy contained therein. It's that there was an actual political theory behind it. Because Bidenomics was very, very, very specifically trying to say that 2024 is 1984. It's morning in America. This was like very explicitly framed that way. And that political theory just crashed and burned, separate from the individual actual policies. And that's why the sort of idea is like, let's be sunny. Let's talk about how things are getting better, like this or that. Like the actual speech that a Joe Biden, who won the Democratic nomination, was supposed to give was going to be a slightly left of center left morning in America speech. And this was explicitly like articulated, telegraphed, et cetera. And that just didn't work on a variety of levels. But sorry, go on.
No, I appreciate that. It absolutely didn't work. And I will say the other implicit piece of the Biden theory was almost what you can think of as a soft Marxism. It was, if we transform the economic conditions of the country, if we build out manufacturing hubs, if we build out infrastructure, if we invest in communities, those communities will in turn vote for us. It was a sort of both theory of, we must just sell this economy to voters and we must build an economy that voters then come to reward us for. And I think on the second part, there's some debate over just whether that was a flawed political theory or whether that the timeline just takes a lot longer for that theory to pan out. Like announcing an investment in a new chip fab is very different than actually employing a lot of people in that chip fab. But either way, the people were not happy. And so Kamala Harris comes in, and the real question for her is, what is her economic message going to be? Mm-hmm. And what she ends up doing is, I think, something very clever, which is she repackages the core elements of Biden's economic agenda as a solution to the cost of living crisis that voters blame Biden for. Mm-hmm. And so let me get into that. Like, you asked about what Bidenomics is. I describe Bidenomics in the piece as a three-legged stool. On the one hand, you have building out the supply side of the economy. This is the investments in clean energy. This is the investments in infrastructure. This is the Chips and Sciences Act. This is like, we're going to build in the real world in ways that address supply shortages and build out supply. The second pillar is, I think, a version of providing social support. This was the stimulus checks that were passed in the American Rescue Plan. This was the expanded child tax credit. And I believe this was the part of the agenda that got lopped off, which was the care agenda. This was like, we are going to build a stronger social safety net for families. That a lot of that got taken out. And the third, in the negotiations over Build Back Better and what became the Inflation Reduction Act. And the third element is sort of this skepticism or willingness to take on corporate power. This is antitrust enforcement. This is putting Lena Khan in charge of the FTC and Jonathan Kanter very high up in the DOJ. This is sort of regulations like the drug price negotiations. And then if I was going to add a fourth pillar that I didn't, it would be sort of a sort of emphasis on a full employment economy. Mm-hmm. But I think that those are sort of the core pillars of the Biden agenda. And then what you see is Harris comes in. She very much frames herself not as a continuation of Biden, but I'm the president who's going to solve your cost of living crisis. I'm the president who's going to build the middle class. I know you are suffering, and here's what I'm going to do to fix the problem of costs. Again, implicitly saying the economy kind of sucks right now, and I'm going to help do it. But the way she's going to do it is through that Bidenomics agenda. It's the very first, in her big suite of economic proposals she announced, the very first one is she wants to build 3 million homes. She wants to squarely address the housing shortage. She wants to take Bidenomics and apply it to housing, in part by cutting red tape and other things. She wants to, at the same time, provide a reinstall the child tax credit that expired because it only lasted a year, which was giving up to $6,000 per year to low and middle income families per child. She wants to, and on the third pillar, she came out with some stuff that was very directionally, I think, focused on corporate power, which is, one was a somewhat controversial federal ban on price gouging in the grocery industry. Another was sort of a cracking down on algorithmic price fixing in real estate markets, but sort of signaling that on all three of these, whether it's building out the supply side, providing social support for families, going after corporate power, she is on board with Bidenomics. She's just framing it as a solution to the problems that people blame Biden for.
And two things in response to what you just said before we move on. So number one, to your point about the Biden theory breaking down when it came to actually manufacturing and building things. So two problems. So one, at a very baseline level, obviously they sort of backstopped this from the beginning by saying like, hey, look, these are long-term investments in the future. There never was this idea that like within a year of passing the Inflation Reduction Act or the infrastructure project program, there was actually just going to be like new factories built everywhere. But that was going to be a problem. But even within that like medium long-term thing, I think there's a real problem of just not being able to deliver enough quickly enough. And to your point, this real, they could do signing ceremonies, they could do unveilings, but there just wasn't enough that was tangible. And there should have been much more effort at a deep policy political level, just like making this as tangible as possible, like as soon as possible. And you see this when, Pete Buttigieg, who usually is a 98% A+ performer on TV, like actually get hobbled when the ABC News interviewer was like saying like, hey, we passed billions for EV charging stations. Why were there only 7 to 8 that were actually built? And by the way, I always say this, but I love how it was like 7 to 8, which literally means, like, this, you worked in professional media. The researchers couldn't actually determine whether there actually were 7 or 8. And there never actually was a very serious push. We actually don't even know how many were actually built, but you just saw him not have any ability to articulate what actually went wrong and what was going on there. And then two, I think this would have been the political solution to the actual problem here, which is there never was going to be a world where you were going to just sort of reindustrialize the country in a 1-year period. But there's an aesthetic political ability you need, which is to convey, hey, the Democratic Party is the party of building things, is the party of manufacturing, is the party of semiconductors, is the party of factories, that they just could never actually really figure out at any level whatsoever. And this kind of problem here, I think, also stems from the fact that ultimately let's say, the New Deal era Democratic Party didn't have this problem. You're building the Hoover Dam, like you're doing the Civilian Conservation Corps. But what was lost in the not only neoliberal era, but post-New Deal era was you had a political system transition to a politics of like, hey, what you do is you pass legislation. You pass the Civil Rights Act, you pass funding for NASA, you do this, or that, without at a political level being deeply concerned with the actual implementation. But implementation is the whole thing. So I think at an aesthetic level, if Pete Buttigieg had not just gone to sort of like unveilings and ribbon cutting ceremonies, but actually very much projected this idea that like, hey, me, Gina Raimundo, the Commerce Secretary, like we're like rolling up our sleeves and actually building things. Obviously, like, not that their two actions would have like made a big difference, but I think at an aesthetic level, I don't think the Democratic Party has any muscle towards the idea of like we build things. The Democratic Party is super ready to say, hey, look, we're going to pass a child tax credit, or hey, we're going to pass big climate legislation. But they failed to really understand, hey, you need to actually do things. So I think that takes us into kind of like the next category here, which is I just did this episode with James Pogue that built off of an interview and big piece he did in the New York Times about Senator Chris Murphy, who's very much in this like center left, like I'm trying to reckon with like what's kind of happening here. He's very clearly trying to position himself in the same way that J.D. Vance and Josh Hawley and Marco Rubio did on the right, which is say, hey, we're younger, up-and-coming politicians. We see that the world of 2016 isn't the world we grew up with. We're the ones who are going to seize this real mantle here. And what just kind of came across in that piece is just at the end of the day, I'd love to hear your take on this. I'm obsessed with post-neoliberal policy. I think these have been the right calls. At a political level, I think the entire project, left and right, has been a total failure. So what I mean by that is Bidenomics fail, we went into that. But like, if you're seeing like JD Vance, if you're seeing all these sort of like new right candidates, Blake Masters isn't just flaming out in the Senate race in Arizona. He's very much sort of like this new right post-neoliberal Republican. He couldn't even make it out of a primary in a congressional seat this cycle. So I'd love to hear from you, like, why, broadly speaking, is this like realignment movement that I'm supposed to say is awesome and is the future is just totally failing at a political level?
Oh, that's a really good question. I will start with that Chris Murphy profile, because I think, and we were both, at a conference together where we heard Chris Murphy give a version of his new speech talking about the spiritual crisis facing America and how Democrats don't have an answer to that spiritual crisis. And I think he's totally right that there is a crisis of meaning, a spiritual crisis broadly defined. But I think my question, and this gets to like, what are we actually doing in the post-neoliberal project?
Yeah.
My question is, how much is our politics actually capable of solving that problem? And how much is that actually what voters want, is to solve these problems of spirituality, of immateriality? I think one of my views is that the failure to build, the failure to solve the problems of the material world, to lower prices, to build housing, to deliver, to fix roads and bridges, to manufacture and build things, create things in America, that the dearth of that, the decline of that, has actually caused our politics to veer more into the immaterial.
Yep.
That the sort of the focus on, to some extent, the culture war, but really this focus on sort of the immaterial dimensions of politics, they emerge when politics feels paralyzed, when it feels unequipped to tackle the tangible problems that people face in their lives. It then veers into this sort of more immaterial dimension that I actually do not think there are many levers to deliver on. And this is where I think there are sort of the two sides of this post-neoliberal project. There is one that very much wants to veer in this spiritual direction and address this crisis of meaning, which again, I do not think there are great tools to do. And I think the attempts that are made are, like, quite frankly, kind of scary. And I think there's this other dimension.
What are some that are scary to you?
Well, I find a little bit of the sort of Adrian Vermeule, Patrick Deneen kind of, we are going to use the state as a vehicle for Catholic morality, as a kind of scary thing. I think there's a great book, A World After Liberalism, which is all about sort of a strain of very radical thinking of using the government to pursue a specific vision of the good, which for a lot of Catholic thinkers, it's a Catholic vision, but there are other versions of that. And like, we are going to solve the crisis of meaning by giving you meaning and enforcing that meaning through things like, I don't know, getting rid of no-fault divorce to enforce a Catholic idea of marriage that I find that very scary. I think there's another dimension of this, though, which is we need to double down on actually addressing the material problems that people face, and think that if we are able to address those problems, that side of our politics, maybe that is what voters actually want. And the last thing I'll say, Marshall, I think what is interesting about the quote unquote, I don't see this project as having failed. I actually think what's really interesting is I think our politics is shifting in a way that makes this project more relevant in a specific way, which is prices have become the new axis of economic conflict.
Yep.
Prices have become the new, ever since the Great Inflation, the salience of prices over the size of government, over taxes, all the old economic issues that I think were at the forefront have been replaced by this cost of living affordability crisis. I think you see this on both sides, where Harris's number one thing is about addressing the housing shortage. And a lot of JD Vance's speech at the RNC is about how immigrants are bidding up the price of housing, and we need to deport immigrants as a way to lower housing costs. I think you are seeing our politics start to shift around the problem of prices. And I happen to think that this abundance agenda, this building agenda, has the best chance of actually solving that crisis because it really is a supply side problem. So.
No, that's very well said. And I think that I have very few genuinely libertarian views, but one I've really come to here is separate from the question of can government fix the crisis of loneliness or the crisis of meaning? I don't think voters are asking that of politicians. Mm-hmm. And what we're really seeing here is it's easy to talk about, and because what's also happening here too is that the zeitgeist is clearly shifting. So clearly there's a lot of dissatisfaction. There's a lot of recognition that there's this problem. Like, this is why schools are now like really aggressively banning phones, and we're having serious conversations about how social media isn't like a good thing beyond just like the obvious like Russiagate 2010s thing. And what politicians are seeing is like, okay, so like we see where the puck is moving. So we're going to be the ones who ride to power. And I don't just mean like in a cynical way, but like, because what you have to see is the opportunity. Like, as James said it on the episode that came out on Tuesday, like, you have to pick up the crown of France when it's sitting in the gutter. And they say like, okay, so like the crown here, the opportunity is there are so many voters who are heterodox. They see the political system not serving them. I'm going to be this person who speaks to their actual needs and concerns. But I just don't see any evidence that to the left, folks are really saying, until Kamala Harris speaks to like my spiritual lack of meaning, or to like my own internal crisis of masculinity, that, I need a Democrat to do that. But also to the right, like I said this in the episode too, like, Senator Josh Hawley did a big book about masculinity last year. It didn't hit. It didn't matter. It's not a part of his brand, because no one, left, right, or center, no Joe Rogan, because like, for example, when Josh Hawley writes that book, he's very much speaking to Joe Rogan voters or Joe Rogan listeners. Joe Rogan listeners aren't trying to have like a 40-something Yale grad who did all the right things and went to all the right schools, like teach them how to be a man. It's just like, this just isn't an area where political actors are going to be able to take the lead. I think they need to recognize these realities, right? So like, I think it's very important that like a center-left Democratic politician understand that he or she can't just sort of run on 2010s lean-in style discourse that only focuses on like women and the struggles that women face in the workplace. Like, actually, there's a very, very, very specific reality, but our society like literally isn't structured in ways that fit the experiences of like men in the 2020s. Like, we should really recognize that we shouldn't just like basically talk about men as if it's like Don Draper in the 1960s. Like, you have to get that, but that's like a foundational understanding. That's not a political program. That's just like a political bet I'm going to make, which is that like, this is just a foundational reality, not something that any one specific politician is going to be able to come with a bill on. But I'd be curious what you think about that.
I know. I think you're right. And I think this gets to what I see as the core structural, or in a sense, like the core question of our politics right now. The core question of our politics since 2016, I think, has been, how do you win over the quote unquote populist quadrant of voters? Mm-hmm. That is a very wonky sentence that I will now explain, which is after, well, I know your audience is wonky, so they might know it. They probably will know what I'm talking about. But basically after 2016, you have this realization that I think previously, a lot of times, what was viewed as the center of American politics was the kind of socially liberal, fiscally conservative, libertarian type. And after 2016, Trump wins by winning over not necessarily just voters who are down the line conservative, mm-hmm. but this huge portion of voters where it's in the 2016 election, this was 30% of the electorate that is liberal or populist on economic issues and more conservative on social issues. That actually this center of American politics was the exact opposite of the center that was like imagined by elites, because in elite circles, the center was a more libertarian type. In the media, it was a more libertarian cosmopolitan worldview. And it turns out in the reality, it was this type. And so Trump wins in part by talking about issues like immigration in a more conservative, build the wall way, and also moving to the center a little bit, saying, I'm not going to cut entitlements. I'm not going to take away your pre-existing conditions. I'm going to raise taxes on people like me. And I think, and he ends up winning by winning over a lot of that quadrant. And I think ever since then, and this is where the Chris Murphy thing comes out of too, there has been a debate on the left and the right, but I think really sharply on the left, as to what is the theory of how we win over those voters. Mm-hmm. And for a while, you have the democratic socialist theory. You have that comes out of the Bernie Sanders 2016 campaign, where Sanders, to his credit, won a lot of conservative Democrats. He won a lot of these populist quadrant voters. And so the theory was, wait, maybe the problem is we haven't been offering a radical enough, transformative enough economic agenda. And so if we do that, then we'll win over these voters. That sort of theory was embodied by Bernie Sanders in the 2020 Democratic primary. The other theory, which was embodied by Joe Biden, was let's tack more to the center on social and cultural issues. Let's come off as really normal. Let's play like a 1990s Bill Clinton Democratic Party game where we just try to come off as not very offensive and normie. And I think in the 2020 primary, the Biden theory clearly wins. But in the post-2020, and after Biden's primary victory, Biden does this very interesting thing where he puts together these Sanders-Biden task forces where members of both factions come together and constitute an agenda. And what you get out of that is a synthesis where you actually get a much more culturally, socially moderate Democratic Party and a party that picks its fights on certain economic issues, whether it's the child tax credit, whether it's lowering prescription drug prices, whether it's fighting corporate power. I think the Democratic Party decides like this is the synthesis that we are going to try to win over working class voters with. And I think you actually really did. I think the Chris Murphy theory is like now a third theory that he is trying to bring into that fold. But I think at the DNC this past week, you really saw this on display. Kamala Harris's speech, right, I think was like carefully curated and engineered to win over that quadrant of voter. She talked about border security, and her big immigration idea was the bipartisan border security bill. She was very even-handed on Israel-Palestine. She talked about the importance of securing the world. On economics, she
referred to a lethal military, which if you follow these spaces, like obviously Twitter got pissed off about this, but as a national security person, that was a very specific choice they made in terms of like framing what the Democratic Party is.
And and this was Kamala Harris, right? On economics, she did take a little bit more of a populist vein, but it was an opportunity economy. It was lowering costs. So I think I very much saw that whole convention and really Kamala Harris as being like a sort of the apotheosis, the culmination of this synthesis that started in the Biden years of this is the Democratic Party's theory of how we're going to win over that voter. We are going to take a little bit more cost-focused populist Bidenomics, you might even call it, that we're going to combine with like tacking to the center on cultural things. And because Kamala Harris is a messenger who inherently excites a lot of our base, we think we can take that risk and still retain our Democratic base.
So two last big questions here. So here's the first one, and I'll editorialize for a quick second. I'm really fascinated by, I say this in a bunch of episodes because I want to make my background clearer here. Like I'm really a person who like grew up, like really wanted to like run for office and be a politician. So like when I look at these figures like Chris Murphy and JD Vance and Josh Hawley, like I am like thinking through the lens of them as politicians who like separate from ideology, like see opportunities and try to get different things. I think what you're seeing here is just like, and this is JD Vance's struggle, this is the new right struggle, is like an inverse of what happened to Democrats during the 2019 primary, which is that like the new right and frankly, like the populist left, which is just completely irrelevant now. The populist left that hasn't found a way to merge themselves with like the Warrenite Biden project. The very like, we have a bunch of podcasts and everyone listens to us left, like just completely irrelevant right now. And I think it's because they've dramatically misread the mood of the country. So in the James Pogue episode, James, who's very much like part of that like populist left, is like talking about how like the real debate right now is like, do we tear down the system or do we reform? And I just like at a very deep, like empathic level, just couldn't empathize with that. But I don't just mean from like a policy objectives perspective, because like obviously I'm like very like moderate and like centrist-y in like my disposition. But putting that aside, I was like, yes, I know there's that poll that says 70% of Americans want to like tear down the system, but like I don't think they're actually asking for that. And I think that when people then operationalize the idea that people want the system to be torn down in a populist manner after just like 15 years of post-financial crisis, 2008 chaos, they're just totally missing it. Like, obviously, it was a bad call for like JD Vance to do the cat ladies thing. I think he comes off as like way too angry and aggressive in his framing. Blake Masters sounds like a psycho when he's talking about like anti-white racism and like just daring call me racist. There's a reason why he had like crazy high negatives. But what they were doing is they were saying like what the American people right now are demanding is like deep anti-system aggressive anger. And despite those polls, I don't think that's quite true. I think the polls that say that 70% of Americans want the system to be torn down are the equivalent of those polls that the socialists love talking about when they say like 80% of Americans demand Medicare for all. It's like, if you're a successful politician, you have to be able to separate, to use the cliche, the poll result from like the actual vibes. And it's just sort of like the kind of actual like dynamic here. So what I'm basically just putting forth here is we have this awkward dynamic where American politics is getting more normal. But what's awkward for people like you and I who are interested in post-neoliberal ideas is that we can't just be complacent about, okay, then it's 2001 again. You know, like everything's great. Like let's pretend that everything's just, if they want normalcy, let's just sit back and basically do nothing, because that would also be a deep mistake. But I'd be curious, like, what your sort of read on, like, what the actual mood of the country is vis-a-vis reform, anger, tear down the system, et cetera.
Oh, that's a really, I think what's especially sharp about that is the parallel on both the left and right.
Yeah.
And I think you're completely right. I sometimes describe myself as a social democrat who was mugged by political realities, like a someone who very much was a long time Bernie Sanders supporter, very much had that kind of tear down the system view, and has just been like, I think, and especially these came across in the 2020 primary, when it actually, push comes to shove, when it actually comes down to decide in elections, that vision just doesn't win. That I think that like there is an institutional conservatism built into American politics, that there is a much more sort of reflective anti-change response. There is simultaneously, I think, an anti-system belief, but a very powerful anti-institutional change conservatism.
Yeah,
like deep in American politics. And those two
quick thing to your point is a disaster if you're a democratic socialist leftist.
Yes,
like an actual, because what the democratic socialists would say is, okay, so let's now articulate the ways we would actually like tear down the system to serve those voters, and then in every single category, the voters will say, yeah, no go on that one, even in democratic primaries.
I think, Marshall, though, the interesting thing that is not a parallel between the parties is, I think that for one of the parties, you have one of its biggest anti-system figures, J.D. Vance, now as the vice president. You have Donald Trump, who is a little bit more heterodox, but is the presidential candidate. And on the left, you have seen that faction of the party functionally excised. You have seen Bernie Sanders and AOC have like wholehearted support for Joe Biden, to the point where they were the ones who were like the last. Bernie Sanders is writing an op-ed in the New York Times very late in the game saying Joe Biden should stay. AOC was making the case very strongly that Joe Biden should stay. At the convention, they wholeheartedly endorsed Kamala Harris. I think what is interesting about this moment is that you have these factions on both sides, but the Democratic Party has a stronger institutional disciplining mechanism. Mm-hmm. For a few reasons, I think. One, the Democratic Party admitted that it lost an election in 2016 and had a reckoning. The reason Donald Trump's denial.
And a quick thing, I want to make this very precise for people. Like, yes, like you have like the cottage industry of like Russiagate and like Mueller, She wrote, and like that very cringe like MSNBC boomer thing. But what we're talking about here are at a policy level, right? Like, and this is, and then a quick thing. Like I was talking to a senior administration official, and he described this as like, oh, there are a lot of Trump Democrats in this administration, and what they mean by calling themselves Trump Democrats aren't Democrats who would vote for Trump in any way, because they wouldn't. But they're saying like Donald Trump's victory permanently scarred us in a way that is going to shape every single decision we make moving forward. And I think that's what we're really speaking to.
Yeah. And I think that goes back to the very beginning of our conversation with the revolution on trade and the thinking that, oh my gosh, if we allow another China shock, it is going to bring this man and politicians like him back into the office. So everything after 2016 for Democrats becomes, how do you stop another Donald Trump? Or how do you stop Donald Trump? It is a full-on reckoning that disciplines the party, and I think causes this synthesis and this excision of those factions that aren't that don't seem like they're the winning theory. On the right, I think one of the biggest harms to the Republican Party of Trump's 2020 victory is that in denying the outcome of the election, he denied the party the opportunity to do its own reckoning. That was not an election that Donald Trump necessarily should have lost. And I think Donald Trump lost the popular vote in 2016. He lost it in 2020. Republicans got wiped out in 2018. They didn't do nearly as well as they should have in 2022. There have been lots of opportunities where like Republicans could have had a chance to have their own reckoning, and they haven't. And I think part of the reason is, one, because of Trump's election denial, two, because of the electoral geography of America, where Democrats have to win over the median voter. Republicans, because of biases in the Electoral College and the Senate, don't necessarily have to win over the median voter. They can win over a slightly right of center voter. And then lastly, I think what you really saw on display the last couple months is the liberal media ecosystem is a much stronger disciplining force than the right-wing media ecosystem. Yep. Like you could never have imagined, like the backlash to Biden emanated from the media. It emanated from the New York Times. It emanated from my former boss, Ezra Klein. There was a lot of pressure on the Democratic Party to change in ways that would allow them to beat Donald Trump from their media, whereas the right-wing media ecosystem has basically become a cult of personality around Donald Trump. And so I think you are right. We have these two parties with these two very, I think, factions that are disconnected from what voters want, but one has a very strong disciplining mechanism that's pulling it towards normal voters, and another is sort of a little bit allowed to be a little bit more unhinged, at least until there's a similar kind of reckoning.
And my last word on this would basically be that, and this is another, because something that I'm very wary of, and it's definitely like limited my branding ability, because like when you have the Realignment frame, I have the Realignment podcast, a lot of people, especially towards the start of the Biden presidency, would like come to me like asking for like, okay, great. Like, tell me why like JD Vance is the future. Tell me whether, and I'm sort of like, oh yeah, no, like that's like not all real. And I think like longer term, this was the proper.
Marshall, are you on the new right? You talk.
Yeah. When we talk about this, like I did a PBS documentary on JD Vance, and like halfway through the conversation, they're like, so like, are you like on the new right? And it's sort of like, guys, if you talk to anyone on the new right, they'd call me a center left squish who this or that, which I think in certain degrees is a accurate dunk on me. But the quick thing here is that like, and this is really what like totally cut the project off for me. The big problem facing the right, the new right specifically, isn't just what you said about there not being this discipline action, but it's actually like the GOP primary base is not policy driven in a way that the Democratic Party's base is policy driven. Here's what I mean by that. So there are a lot of like horseshoe leftists who I think understandably, I think they got there in good faith, who like got excited about Josh Hawley and JD Vance and Marco Rubio under the idea that like, okay, cool. Like they are actually coming at corporate power, at the wealthy in this like really, really aggressive way. And like, yes, it's true, but like they're going to make me uncomfortable on certain social issues. But pre-Dobbs, it was like easier to basically wash that away and basically do the whole like, oh, the Democratic Party scaremongers about abortion, but like it's all basically fake news, like whatever. But, you know, JD Vance, when he started running for the primary in Ohio, he was talking about, hey, like we're going to raise taxes on these wealthy capitalist hedge funders who hate you. He's getting at this whole like diploma divide idea. But under the idea, and this is why this makes sense, JD could easily write a compact magazine piece saying, here is why it's not inconsistent and actually deeply socially conservative for us to tax these like Wall Street tech billionaires who then use their ill-gotten gains to like spend money on ad campaigns in favor of increasing mass immigration that hurts you. You could definitely coherently, intellectually write that thing. GOP primary voters didn't care. Did not care whatsoever. And JD quickly dropped that as like a part of his plank. GOP primary voters don't really care about the unions thing. Like I know that Josh Hawley and JD Vance, like they do like the picket line thing. And I think that actually does matter at a political level. I think it's like a good thing for our political system that unions are seen as this space in the new center where we should really compete on. But GOP primary voters are not demanding that they do that. And that just serves as a real blocker for these new right-centric policy efforts, which is that there's just a demand for wonkery. And this is an education divide issue. Yeah. There's a demand for wonkery on the left that just doesn't exist on the right, that just serves as like an actual limiting factor on all these like new right realignment projects that should make one pretty skepticism of their ability to actually succeed like longer term. Because like my actual last word on this, and I'll let you close with your last word, is I have been doing more and more abundance agenda related episodes. And what's so funny about those abundance agenda episodes is I got a crazy amount of outreach from center left, like normie, reform-minded Democrats in our age cohort. Because what they were literally saying is like, dude, I love this abundance agenda. Do more abundance agenda. I specifically need this so I could take it to my constituents and so that I could be more competitive in my actual state. Because what they're articulating here is, let's separate ideas for a second. You are rewarded in the Democratic Party for being an ideas person, for being a policy wonk person. And they're just like, look, to be pretty frank with you, I know what the socialism thing doesn't work, so I'm trying to find what the next thing is. And that just speaks to me. There's no equivalent on the right for that instinct, and that's a huge problem. So close us out. We hit so many different topics. You could close however you want to close on these subjects. We're going to keep having these conversations, but please close out.
Oh, this is great. I think we could talk for many more hours, Marshall. I will say one quick thing on the populist, the new populist right, which is like you, I feel like I've been constantly waiting for this. When is this going to turn from a handful of senators into a real movement and a real like actual dominate the party? I think there's a theory from folks on the inside of that movement, which is the problem is actually Donald Trump, because Donald Trump has conflictual instincts himself. It is not until after him that there's going to be a civil war within the party. And then after that, this new faction will emerge. I, like you, am more skeptical because I think it's both what you said about the GOP base not really caring about it, but there's another part of it, which is the GOP voter primary base. These issues are not very salient for, but these issues are very salient for the GOP donor base. And they're salient in the opposite way, that GOP donors really like low taxes. They really like the Reagan agenda. And GOP primary voters don't really care. And so when you have that mismatch, it's really hard to override the preferences of your donor class for something that's not going to really help you win a primary because you know it's going to help you win over swing voters. That's where the disciplining mechanisms come in. You need something that can actually get the party focused on the swing voter instead of just the base and the donors. And I think, though, you're right, though, I think one other thing that's different about the Democratic Party is the Democratic Party is much more ideologically diverse, right? Because you have so many voters of color, you have a lot more conservative Black voters, conservative Hispanic voters in the Democratic tent. And so you can't just run on a purely like down the line ideological message. Like you need to run on certain, in addition to the wonk culture, you need to run on policies that have a much more broad appeal. And I will just close by saying I'm a big fan of the show, and I'm excited to keep listening as you all document what I do really think is an emerging paradigm, and we'll see where it goes from here.
Yeah, well, this has been great, Rogé. Thank you for joining me on the Realignment.
It's been my pleasure, Marshall.